The History of Scotland. Part 1. The First Scots. The Scottish landscape we see today was formed during the last Ice Age. Unlike most of Europe, during the last Ice Age, there was practically no life in Scotland. Instead, Scotland was covered in glaciers, in parts miles deep, similar to present-day northern Greenland. These slow-moving rivers of ice scarred the Scottish landscape, wearing away at the weaker rocks and leaving behind only a harsh, rocky and rugged mountainous landscape. Slowly, as the world warmed and the ice melted and retreated, the mountains, valleys and lochs were exposed for the first time. Soon the plants began to make their return, and with them came the animals. 15,000 years ago, the fauna in Scotland was very different to today. There were the great Irish elk called Megaloceros, standing at twice the height of a man, with antlers 12 feet wide and weighing in more than a bison. There were mammoths and woolly rhinos as well. Predators arrived too, huge polar bears and European brown bears, along with packs of wolves and lynx, some of which would survive well into recorded history. This was the world that the first humans who came to this country encountered 14,000 years ago. We don't know who these people were, what language they spoke, what they called each other, or even really what they looked like, beyond scant glimpses in archaeology in other countries. We know them really only by the flint tools they left behind, with which they likely hunted the megafauna that roamed Scotland. But soon the climate fluctuated again, and the ice returned, driving out the animals and those first few Scots. This was the Younger Dryas, the last period of the true Ice Age. When the world warmed again, around 9,600 BC, many of the animals and plants began to return. And this time the great Scots pine arrived, covering the landscape in a thick coat of evergreen trees. As half the world away, the first cities began to form in the Levant and the Fertile Crescent. Humans finally made their return to Scotland. These people were semi-nomads who travelled with the animals they depended on, hunting them with weapons of stone and flint, before returning to semi-permanent structures to last out the harsh winters. Though we know little about them, we do know that they were not a simple people. Near the banks of the River Dee in Aberdeenshire is one of the most important artefacts in human history. You would not notice it if you stood in it, as generations of Scots who have lived around it for thousands of years have not. Indeed, it went unnoticed until the 21st century, when it was spotted from the air. Over hundreds of feet are arranged 12 pits that line up with the phases of the moon when viewed from a single point. Nearly 10,000 years ago, over 5,000 years before they were developed anywhere else, the early Scots had invented the first calendar. This was likely used to track the progress of the year and inform the hunters when to leave their winter abodes and to rejoin the great herds of animals in the Scottish landscape. This was how the first Scots lived for thousands of years, with a small but gradually increasing population of hunter-gatherer peoples. Over time they became more sedentary too, with a number of tools found at these early camps ticking up from the thousands in the early period to the hundreds of thousands by 6,500 BC. The diet of these people was changing and diversifying too. Evidence of fishing and the consumption of shellfish begins to become apparent by around 8,500 years ago. Huge caches of hazelnuts and snail shells have also been found as the population needed to begin utilising more food resources to feed more people. These people also began to produce a pigment called red ochre, and made a purple dye from crushed remains of shellfish, with which they painted the great stone rock carvings that today can still be seen through the Scottish Highlands. But then a disaster hit. Sometime around the year 6200 BC, a huge chunk of rock detached from the Norwegian continental shelf, and 6,500 square kilometres of rock fell into the ocean, causing the biggest tsunami in human prehistory. The nearly 100-foot tall tsunami wiped out the last human existence on the Doggerland archipelago to the east of Scotland, and ploughed into the Scottish coast, with water travelling up to 50 miles inland and only stopping at the foot of the Highland Mountains. To the population of ancient Scotland, this was the apocalypse, and thousands died of a population that likely only numbered a few thousand to start with. This event may have had such an impact that it survived in the mutated form in some ancient folklore, with the ancient Welsh poem of Clachai Cantra Gwaelod recording the following: "Beneath the sea and its waves are many cities fair that used to listen to the bells ringing at the coming night, but through idle negligence of watch on the tower, the bells of Cantra Gwaelod vanished beneath the water." Cantra Gwaelod is said to be the Welsh version of Atlantis, a land lost beneath the waves in a great flood, said to be in Cardigan Bay off the west coast of Wales. Today we know that this area was likely inundated during that great tsunami that killed so many of those first Scots. And while today the legend bears very little resemblance to what we know happened, perhaps even hundreds of generations later, there is some echo of that event in the legend of Cantra Gwaelod. There is no evidence for humans in Scotland over the next few hundred years, though no doubt they were still there, just in far smaller numbers, recovering from that cataclysm. If it was these few survivors who rebuilt or were mixed in with new immigrants that revitalised Scotland, we simply don't know. But by 5300 BC, there was a community of people living like the earlier pre-cataclysm Scots on the Isle of Orosue in the Western Isles of Scotland. They continued to live by the seasons, likely using the same knowledge of the lunar calendar as their likely ancestors 3,000 years earlier did. Up until this point, though these people were sophisticated and somewhat sedentary, they were still very much a part of the natural world, fundamentally dependent and not fully separate from it. In the next chapter of Scottish history, this will change forever.